the most shocking part of this book and the 2-year reporting project that went into it was the aid section, because everywhere I went, I saw that aid was not benefiting. Largely, there were small parts of it that were benefiting the poor, but largely was benefiting the richest people in the world, the corporations and the local elite. The second part of that is that this is not a mistake. Originally, when I first started reporting, I was like, okay, well, they've obviously not thought this out. But when you start looking at the history of it and you look at how aid developed out of the fall of formal colonialism, you realize this has been designed from the start.
Most people understand that corporations have a lot of power, too much power, over all of our lives, that often private business interests can subvert democracy and the kinds of governments enacting the kinds of policies that people want. But that can often be a vague feeling, a suspicion. Our guest today has some meat to put on the bones, however. Matt Kennard has been a journalist in this field for more than a decade, looking at how private business often supersedes and undermines the will of peoples around the world. Matt Kennard, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
We're very happy to have you back on Novara after many years. And we've got you back on to talk about your newish book, Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. That's obviously the theme of a lot of the questions I'm going to ask today, really. What's happened to democracy and what's the role of the private sector? Before we go any further, tell our audience, our viewers, our listeners a little bit about yourself. Why are you an authority on the silent coup?
Good question, because my day job is working for Declassified UK and we focus on British foreign policy. So this is a bit of a departure from that. But essentially, in 2014, I started as a fellow at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. And at the same time, another journalist called Claire Provost, who's the co-author of the book, she started as a fellow as well. And she'd left The Guardian to take the fellowship. I'd recently left the Financial Times. And we started talking because we had 2 years. The contract was 2 years. And the guy who gave it to us said, you don't have to report to me. You do what you want. And you got a travel budget as well. So we started thinking big. We thought, what are the biggest issues of the day in the world? Claire had been covering aid at The Guardian. I'd been covering sort of the World Bank and other places in Washington when I was with the FT. And it was kind of a meeting of minds. And we both kind of agreed that this is the biggest issue of the day, in my opinion, and hers. And I think if you read the book, it's quite a persuasive argument. It should be everyone's opinion, because what you've seen over the last, particularly since the Second World War, but this is a battle that's been raging for 400 years, because that's when the first modern joint stock company was invented in England, actually. And what you've seen is corporations have just gradually been trying to get as much power as they can from the state. Originally, corporations were chartered by the Crown. So it was a privilege to create a corporation. It wasn't a right. Then there was a civil rights battle, particularly in the 19th century, where lots of legislation came into place that unleashed the corporation from the state in the UK, then later the US. And then after the Second World War, this really went international. That was the age of the multinational, pretty much in the context of the Bretton Woods institutions, which were created in 1944. And that was the IMF and the World Bank principally, but also later on the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, which became particularly important in sort of greasing the entry of...
Which is now the WTO.
Exactly. In 1995, it became the WTO. It originally was going to be a WTO, but it took a long time. GATT, the formation of GATT was a kind of stopgap, and what it became was just rounds of talks. So you had like a Kennedy round in the 60s where all countries got together and tried to reduce tariffs mutually. It wasn't that successful. Certain rounds were successful. The Uruguay round led to the WTO in the 90s. But anyway, so that whole architecture allowed corporations to really go international. And the other part of this story, which is really opposite to the thesis, and I think understanding where we are today, is that after the Second World War, formal empires were collapsing at quite a quick clip, particularly in the 50s and 60s. And the people who had been in power for centuries, the imperial powers and their financial sectors, were scared. They were thinking, how are we going to maintain our control of the world where we don't have a formal empire, where we can't position garrisons of troops in a foreign place that can just take out a leader if they start nationalizing our assets or wherever it was. And there was quite a lot of conscious policy making at that time to try and create, and this sounds like tinfoil hat stuff, but it's all there in black and white in the archives of places like the World Bank, the IMF, and other places. So essentially, they wanted to create a supranational system whereby they could bypass rebellious peoples, bypass newly liberated countries, bypass liberation movements in the developing world. So they set about that task. In the book, it opens with what is called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement System. And that is the first project that we started at the Centre for Investigative.
So that again, the Investor-State
Dispute Settlement System is called ISDS.
Yeah.
And it is that the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that they give these institutions these kind of hard to say names and long acronyms so people just switch off. And that is the first reaction you get when you discuss these things. But then you start explaining what this is. You say, okay, well, this is a shadow legal system whereby multinational corporations can sue states for enacting policies they don't like, which infringe on their quote unquote investor rights. And it happens all over the world. This system is enshrined in free trade agreements, which are a bit of a misnomer because free trade agreement makes you think it's all about mutual lowering of tariffs. But actually, embedded in these trade agreements are huge amounts of legal mechanisms whereby corporations can enforce their will on the countries that are part of that agreement. One of these is the ISDS system. So NAFTA has ISDS provisions in it, plenty of other free trade agreements.
So when the EU makes a trade agreement with a country in sub-Saharan Africa, it has ISDS in it.
Exactly. And there's the other part of this is what are called bilateral investment treaties or BITs. And they're all over the world. They're between two countries. And they just sort of, they're an investment regime that both countries have to abide by. But ISDS is enshrined in nearly all of those. So, and is enforced. So in the case of a corporation that wants to use a BIT, for example, you can just create a shell company in a country that has a BIT with the country you want to sue and just sue them that way. That happens all the time. So there's this whole web of treaties, agreements, which enshrine this ISDS system. And what it means, effectively, away from all the acronyms, all the boring stuff, is that corporations can sue some of the poorest countries in the world for huge amounts of money, billions of dollars often, for enacting policies like not allowing the company an environmental permit to dig for gold, for example. That was one case we looked in El Salvador. There was one case in Egypt where a French water company sued the Egyptian government for raising the minimum wage. So anything that a corporation doesn't like that a government does, they can potentially sue for. Now, you would think that that is a massive attack on democracy, and it is, because the second part of it is it's not just the cases that get to court. Now, most of these cases are heard at a place called the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, ICSID, which is a part of the World Bank.
Say that one again, Matt, because we're going to have lots of these.
The ICSID, the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes,
right?
ICSID. It's an arm of the World Bank. It was created in 1966 at the height of what I'm talking about, at the height of decolonization and newly independent governments. And what it is the main venue where these cases are heard it's also a kangaroo court. There's so much to get out on this stuff, but it's also a kangaroo court because these decisions are made by 3 arbitrators, one appointed by the company, one appointed by the government, and one agreed on by both. These arbitrators have to have there's no threshold for legal history or any kind of professional attainment. But we found that a lot of them have come from US administrations. There are plenty that came from the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. So, and the decision, and it's hugely secretive. A lot of the documents you can't get your hands on. But to go back to my point is that it's not just the cases that are heard at ICSID and this wealth transferred to the corporations that is the major issue. Regulatory chill and policy making chill is the major issue, because if you have this huge infrastructure in place, this huge web of economic arrangements whereby multinationals can sue you, it means that it impacts on your thinking when you're devising policies in your countries. And we saw this in a very specific way in places like Guatemala. For example, there was a case where we got Freedom of Information Act documents from the Guatemalan government showing internal deliberations about whether they should grant a multinational mining company an environmental permit next to this community. And it was going to be affecting their community and their environment. You would think when a government is deliberating whether to grant an environmental permit, their main priority would be what impact does this have on our people? But actually the internal deliberations within the Guatemalan government were about, are we going to get sued by that company if we enact that policy? They eventually gave them the environmental permit. And that happens all over the world, this policy-making chill. And it's by design. Corporations want to have an insurance mechanism where they can get their profits and get the policies they want in place above the heads of national governments.
You also use the example of South Africa, which is incredible. So you have obviously post-apartheid South Africa. We've transitioned to democracy. And in the mid-1990s, they're saying that in companies which have mining rights in the country, obviously it's been a phenomenal producer of gold, diamonds, etc. over the years, South Africa. They're saying 26% of kind of management or ownership needs to be in the hands of Black South Africans. And this is pushed back by Italian investors. And so I think there's this incredible moment where we're told in the West that, oh, now South Africa has transitioned to democratic government. But in fact, a democratically elected government with an overwhelming mandate, which is what the ANC has in the 1990s. I mean, it's basically a one-party state, still is to an extent. But with democratic legitimacy, they can't do what they want because of this regulatory chill you talk about. Can you talk about the example of South Africa a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this was the craziest case we looked at because we went to South Africa to report on the ground from what had happened in that case. And essentially, it's like you say, after apartheid, Black empowerment policies were brought in to make just the historical injustices of apartheid. One of them was that all companies had to give a percentage of their company to historically disadvantaged people, so Black people. Now, this Italian company didn't like that, and they said, we're going to take you to ICSID. And essentially, the whole case was kept really quiet by the South African government because they didn't want to incentivize other companies to do it. So it was really under the radar. Not many people in South Africa knew about this case. And what happened was there was a settlement out of court where the government just wanted to keep it quiet. So they said, okay, well, you don't have to abide by this regulation. So this Italian company didn't have to do it. But afterwards, the South African government tried to escape from this system completely. And that in itself was interesting because a lot of what these systems are about is locking countries into these systems and allowing no way out. So one of the interesting parts of the bilateral investment treaties is that they often have things called sunset clauses, where even if you cancel them, you can't. That doesn't come in for 10 years. By which time these people are hoping there'll be a different government that doesn't have the same predilection to get out. It's interesting. It's what Thomas Friedman called it the golden straitjacket, but it's obviously not golden. But the South Africans were trying. Interestingly, in Latin America, the liberation governments of Correa, Chavez in Venezuela, and Evo Morales, they all tried to leave as well during the sort of first pink tide in the 2000s, and they found it very difficult as well. And in fact, I went to interview Evo Morales at his house in Bolivia last year, and he was talking about this system because he nationalized a lot of companies, one of which was a British power company called Ruralec, and Ruralec took Bolivia to one of these tribunals. This one was actually at The Hague, and won tens of millions of pounds from the Bolivian government. So it's all over the world. It's enshrined in these bilateral investment treaties. In the case of South Africa, another interesting part of it is we were talking to people that had been in the government at that time, at post-apartheid, and they'd said that actually these bilateral investment treaties were just presented as a bit of diplomatic goodwill. So Mandela would go to Belgium and they'd say, okay, welcome back into the fold. You're being reintegrated into the global economy. Let's just sign this nice bit of paper. This is what happened. And then 10, 15 years later, they're getting hit with all these suits that they didn't even know it was possible to activate through these agreements. And that's often how it's done. It's a hugely secretive and quietly done system, which is why people like you who know about economics, you know about these things, a lot of the people who I explain this to, they're sort of like, why do I not know about this? And I think that's by design. They don't want people to talk about it. But if you talk to governments that are trying to go against corporate rule within their own countries, but also internationally, they all know about it. So that's why Evo Morales was talking about it when I was asking about corporate power, because for him, it was an extremely powerful way that corporations could override his decisions. There are enforcement mechanisms that it's not like you can just say, okay, we're not going to listen to you. If arbitration, if you're called to an arbitration, you don't recognize it, they can start taking your assets internationally. They can. There's a lot of ways of enforcing this system on developing countries. So it's not like somewhere. It's not like domestically where you could just used to be able to nationalize something and then you should pay compensation, but that would be negotiated. This is like this international court will decide, and you have to pay. Otherwise, we'll start stripping you.
So what? I mean, you alluded to it there, but what would happen if they didn't pay? So let's say Bolivia takes a mining company owned by the US away from them. The court says, no, you need to, and they're taking it into public ownership. And the court said, this is quite a reasonable one, right? Rather than the case of the Italians in South Africa, which is completely unacceptable, I think. They say, no, you have to give it back to them. And they say, no. They fine them a couple of $100 million. They say, well, we don't recognize this court or this fine. What happens then?
Well, there's actual legal systems in place where they can take your assets internationally. So if you have any kind of government assets in foreign countries, they can be taken. If you have boats in international waters, they can be taken. It becomes a legal matter. But also, you can be massively punished by the Bretton Woods institutions themselves, because ICSID is part of the World Bank, but also so the IMF. They can do really punitive things that mean that you basically can't function. Your credit lines will be pulled. You won't be able to get liquidity if you need it in a time of crisis. All these things that make someone like Evo Morales, who you would not expect to abide by a system that he doesn't think is just, he abided by it, and they did pay it. There were negotiations. The company Ruralec didn't get the fee that they wanted, but they got millions. And interestingly, while we were working on this, I actually sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the British government about the Ruralec case to get emails between the embassy and London during this case, and it showed that the embassy in Bolivia were lobbying on behalf of Ruralec, which actually is unlawful, because governments are not meant to be involved in these investor-state dispute settlement systems. And there was one email that was headlined "Lobby on Ruralec." That was a British embassy email. Like all these things, nothing ever happened because they just ignored our article.
Well, so say this again. The British embassy,
in Bolivia,
was lobbying on the behalf of a private company.
Who was in a dispute with the Bolivian government. It's not lawful, and the ICSID system and the investor-state dispute settlement system is meant to be outside of state control and outside of state influence, but in this case it wasn't, and it was extremely obvious. I mean, it was interesting that they released that email to me, because I think they probably just didn't know that they weren't allowed to lobby, because a lot of part of their job is to lobby for business. That's what embassies do.
Most journalists don't cover this stuff, right? Yeah. I mean, they probably, they don't even know if it's legal or not. And even if it is illegal, who the hell's going to talk about it?
Exactly, yeah.
If it's not Matt Kennard or somebody at Novara Media or,
I mean, can I just say one more really messed up part of this, which is, for me, is kind of maybe the most messed up part, is that there's been a whole industry now created around this investor-state dispute settlement system called third-party financing, which is whereby there are boutique financial firms now, which their sole purpose is to lend money to corporations who are suing states. And those claims against states are the collateral that they give the loan to. And they say, we'll give you millions to pay for the legal fees, or whatever it is. Actually, it's not only just to pay for the cost of the case, it's to say to expand. In the case of Ruralec, they were funded by a third-party financer, and the third-party financer said, we will help Ruralec expand. But what the deal is that if they win the case against the state, these companies, these financial companies, get a cut of that award. And we're talking about sometimes billions. As I said, Occidental Petroleum, a case against Ecuador, which was quite famous. They got billions of dollars. There's a case now against Honduras, whereby they denied a company the right to build a special economic zone in Honduras, and they're getting sued for $11 billion. Honduras, tiny little country in Central America.
They're being sued because they won't build a special economic zone.
Yeah, by the company. I don't know the specifics, but I think they'd probably come to some agreement, or they've got
$11 billion.
Yeah, but the other point of this is you said that, okay, maybe the rural case, there's a case for getting compensation. Okay, that's true. But part of capitalism rests on the fact that you take a risk when you invest, right?
Of course.
And the higher the risk, the bigger the return. So if you go to Congo and you want to get a diamond mine or whatever it is, then you might get expropriated. But that's why you go there, because the potential for huge rewards. This insures you against that. It's a massive insurance mechanism whereby corporations de-risk the whole of capitalism, and it's totally against the capitalist model. And the funny thing about the ISDS system is, when you talk to people on the inside about all these different systems that benefit corporate power around the world, most of them have quite a sophisticated and persuasive ideology built up on top of them to justify them to the general public, but also to the people working within them. In this case of the ISDS system, there's barely anything. Like, even talking to people say, the one thing they say is this is about increasing investment to the developing world, because corporations are going to be much less scared to go and invest in the developing world if they can be sure that they'll get compensated if bad things happen to them. But that just doesn't hold up, because Brazil is one country which never signed up to ICSID and has never been hit with one of these cases, because it doesn't include them in their different agreements. Has Brazil ever had a problem with foreign direct investment? I don't think so. There's no corollary. It's a naked attempt to insure companies against risk, and a naked attempt to allow corporations to go over the heads of national governments. And it's not a coincidence that it was created in 1966, because the 60s was really the time when large parts of Africa, Asia, were really becoming free of the imperial powers. And
the winds of change,
exactly,
as Wilson said.
Yeah. So they thought, well, we can't have that. We've got to create a system whereby we can maintain that imperial control and maintain the control of the investors, maintain the control of the corporations, without having to have formal garrisons of troops or whatever it is in those countries. And they did it. It's successful. 2023, it has taken off. It's gone wild, because what we sort of did analysis of how many cases there had been since it was created in 1966. And it picked up massively after the end of the Cold War, because it was resurgent, rampant capitalism. There was no other pole for countries to organize around. So they had to be integrated into the system. There was nowhere else they could go. And Eastern Europe, the ISDS was a massive part of all the agreements that they signed. So, I mean, part of the rest of the rest of the book is also about this system of that countries that come out of the cold are integrated into. But this is a major part of it. I mean, we can go on to some of the others now as well. You
said about Honduras a moment ago, so I had to check Honduras' GDP. Its GDP is $29 billion. So $11 billion is quite a lot. When you think, the UK GDP is about $3 trillion, $2.8 trillion. Yeah, so you're looking at almost half of their economic output in a year. What you're describing with these agreements is, like you say, just a clarification on my part, there's an insulation from any downside whatsoever. And like you say, normally there is risk with capital. If you go and invest in an ISA or a pension, you will be told quite explicitly, you're not guaranteed a return here. You may even lose your initial investment. But what we have here is basically the equivalent of, you can go and open a shop on the high street, and even if nobody turns up, even if you don't sell anything, you can't lose money. Don't worry. And that isn't what capitalism is meant to be. And I'm not defending capitalism or attacking capitalism, but that's merely a description of this system here. What you're describing really is a complete, and that obviously this thread runs throughout the book, is really a complete subversion of democracy. And it is interesting for me in this country, people have talked about taking back control. And it seems very obvious that for much of the global south, and it should be said, a lot of the global north too, I mean, you just mentioned Eastern Europe, but other places as well, as we'll go on to discuss, democracy is a mirage. It doesn't exist with this stuff. And often you would have heard over the last couple of decades, particularly since early 2000s with the protests against WTO and so on, we have neo-colonialism. But it sounds to me you're just describing colonialism.
Yeah.
So what is it? Is it neo-colonialism? It doesn't sound like there's anything particularly neo about it.
Yeah, well, there's this whole school of thought called post-colonialism. I don't see it. I think that it's the same dynamics but altered for a new reality. So they had to abide by the newly independent and peoples and the new liberation movements which took off after the Second World War. They would have liked not to do that, but they had to adjust for a new reality. And they did. And they did it undercover. I mean, no one knows about this ISDS system. No one knows about the reality of aid, which is another major strand.
We'll talk about that, yeah. Hold your fire there.
And no one, but literally the left and the right, and the left's maybe worse than the right in terms of misunderstanding what aid is, but they not only adjusted, they repackaged it as saying we're helping the developing world and we're helping you to develop, and you see that across the board. And what's quite interesting is obviously when you look at the archives, which we did, and you look at the internal deliberations, it's the opposite. They're talking quite consciously about enshrining and maintaining their control. It's just that the public posture was about all these wonderful things that we wanted to give people. And this is another part of this corporate coup, is that huge part of it is about what is called corporate social responsibility, which is corporate propaganda. It's about presenting this corporate system and this corporate colonialism as a wonderful benefit for the rest of humanity. Now, I covered the mining industry at the Financial Times for a year, and it was amazing. I went to one of the mining conferences in South Africa, and there were all these presentations by mining companies, and you'd barely know that these mining companies were digging for gold or anything. Nearly 90% of what they talked about was all the wonderful things that they were bringing to the local communities. It would just be slides of schools and hospitals and all this stuff. It sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. It was literally like I was just in like a Oxfam International conference or something. But that was a really, really conscious decision by the corporate sector, particularly in mining in the 90s, because they were having trouble with what they called a social license. Operations on the ground were becoming more and more difficult because their reputation was so bad and people wanted to kick them out. So they thought, we're going to have to get that social license back. So they launched this huge corporate social responsibility thing. But that's also what happened after the Second World War with development, the word development. They said that they started saying, well, we want the world to develop. We want poor people have to develop. And it has to be but what does development mean? It's export-orientated growth. It has to be that you don't exist for these institutions if you're a subsistence farmer and you've been doing it for 1,000 years. It doesn't matter. You only exist if you are producing produce for the market. So they reorientated all these economies in the name of development to benefit the global market and to benefit these companies and this system. But it's a massive illusion that post-colonialism ever happened. We live in the midst of it.
So I think lots of people instinctively they won't know all these facts and details, and they'll go, wow, that's really interesting. But so that kind of tallies with what I suspected. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of this, because you say a lot of this happens in the crucible of the end of colonialism 1.0. Obviously, the British Empire really is collapsing in the 50s and 60s. I mean, really after the mid-1950s. And it's around this time we hear about a guy called Hermann Josef Abs, a German banker.
Yeah.
Can you explain who he is and why he's important? Yeah,
he's a very, I think, I don't know now in Germany, but at the time he was a very prominent figure in Germany. And in 1957, he went to a conference of industrialists in San Francisco and presented a proposal for what I talked about, which is this investor-state dispute settlement system. It wasn't called that then, but what he said was, we need to ensure that, essentially, this sounds over the top, but essentially people don't have control of their own resources because it's a problem for us. And he referenced things like the coup in Iran in 1953, the following year, which was done by MI6 and CIA because the Democratic Prime Minister had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company.
Just for our audience, there's a man called Mossadegh.
Mossadegh, yeah. And he was taken out in a joint CIA MI6 coup. Iran's never been a democracy again. He was a moderate. I mean, it was part of this Cold War thing of trying
He's probably centre-right, actually.
Yeah.
But it was called National Front.
But the red line for these people was you can't use your resources for your own people. He wanted to give a higher percentage to the Iranian state. Therefore, the Iranian people to the detriment of the British investors, not allowed Following year, CIA takes out the Social Democratic president of Guatemala in 1954 at the behest of the United Fruit Company, because again, Arbenz, the president, had the temerity to say that maybe we could distribute a little bit of fallow land back to some peasants. No, not allowed, we'll take you out. Suez Crisis, 1956, NASA nationalizes the Suez Canal. UK, France, Israel invade. Again, so he's referencing all these things. He's saying, look, we don't want to have a system where we have to go in hard like this. We need a system that works above these people's heads, so it doesn't matter if these people get in power. They have no power anyway. The investor-state dispute settlement system is a major part of that. But another part of it is, we could move on to this, is aid and creating global economies that rely and are based around attracting investment. Sorry, shall I go on in a minute, or do you want to come back on that?
I like this style you have. Like, sorry, don't need to say sorry, Matt. Well, I just want to stick with Hermann Josef Abs for a second, because this is the world that we live in, right? We think of it as 21st century capitalism and so on. But Josef Abs is working for Deutsche Bank in the late 1930s, right, under the Third Reich. And that is the world that we still live in. Very much colonial powers, the idea of white supremacy, European hegemony, markets, and us making profits here in Europe and North America matter far more than people in Africa and South America and Asia. And I think it's really important to name names. I mean, you've got him. There's a few others too, and I suppose we'll turn to those. But it's still very much their world. And this idea of, you write about a Magna Carta moment for global capitalism, inherently tied to ideas of pre-war colonialism. Like, there's just such a clear continuation. Let's talk about aid, because that is something that our audience probably thinks, okay, it's got some downsides, but it's generally good. Why are you not such a fan of overseas development aid?
Well, put it like this, okay? This is what I always say to people, because I think that there's no topic that the left gets more wrong than aid. David Cameron, not known as a great advocate for the poor, is he? In 2010, the austerity government that began then with George Osborne was what created one of the worst crises for the British poor for generations. At the same time, he went on TV and was talking up how he was dedicating 0.7% of GDP to aid. Now, how do you square those two things? Why is he hammering the poor here to the point where, I can't remember what the stat is. I think it's 250,000 people or 100,000 people that might have died because of austerity.
We think at least 150,000, right?
At least 150,000.
Excess deaths.
Yeah, excess deaths. But yet while he's doing that and enacting those policies, he's promising that we'll maintain a certain level of GDP towards aid for foreigners. It's not because he cares about the poor in the developing world. It's because aid is a massive subsidy to his friends in the corporate sector and is a massive tool for geopolitical control as well. That's the other thing, because a lot of the work I do with Declassified actually is about aid programs. So, for example, did one recently about how British aid had been used to set up an anti-government coalition in Venezuela, or about how aid had been used to try to persuade Bolsonaro's Brazil to privatize oil and gas. Or it's just there's one organization particularly called the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which I'd tell people to look into. Again, another acronym and another long name that sounds boring, but again, it's just a massive slush fund for the state to enact its geopolitical control. But that's one element of it. The other element of it is the subsidy to corporations, and you see this all across the board. There's one institution which we focus on particularly, which is emblematic of this aid system, which is the International Finance Corporation. Again, another arm of the World Bank, again created in the context of these newly independent countries in 1956, in this case. The idea was to invest in private companies. So the World Bank before it was about transfer of capital to governments. And this was about how, in the name of development and it's a stated goal of alleviating global poverty, they would invest in private corporations. The argument being that they'd invest in corporations that would otherwise not want to go to certain places. But I spent years looking at the IFC eventually, and went to countless countries, and it's an absolute joke, racket. From Myanmar, also known as Burma, we went there to report on the IFC. I'll just give you this one example. And the IFC had invested, this is one of the poorest countries I've ever been to, dirt poor. I think the fewest doctors per person in the world, maybe. And they'd poured capital into this 5-star hotel built by this Malaysian oligarch. And so you went from the street, we went to the hotel. Just poor people everywhere, real sort of destitution. And then you'd walk through these doors and it's just this air-conditioned, beautiful hotel with like huge a buffet, all these men and women in all these men in suits. And that was copied around the world. Wherever I went to a diamond mine in Tanzania.
There's lots of good stories here, so slow down.
Yeah.
The one that really caught my imagination was that we, the British taxpayer, were paying for gated communities, which I just found so mad. We're paying for social and economic apartheid in the third world or developing countries in the name of development. And I found myself, this is the thing, Max, you said the left is quite bad on this. I read that. I read a few other things too. So we're talking about separate things here. The World Bank and what it does. Let's put a pin in that for a moment. And what the British government does with its own overseas aid. I read that thing about the British overseas aid, and I felt my inner Farage come out. Just scrap international aid. Mm. And I think if you tell most people that international aid is just it's a scam to a significant extent, not all of it, they sort of look at you rather strangely. But the reality is, of course, we should be spending money on reproductive rights, contraception, clean drinking water, education programs. Of course, but that's not the majority of aid, is it?
No. And like you say, there is a segment of it. And I know people in the aid industry, and there's really good people that work in it. Yeah. And the bit that is really important is disaster relief. So, for example, when I worked for the Financial Times, they sent me to Haiti after the earthquake. And organisations like Oxfam, and which is funded by the UK government, and lots of other groups were doing vital work to keep people alive. This is it was apocalypse there. But that's actually quite a small section of it. And the real money is going towards subsidising corporations, and it's a massive asset, a revenue stream for them. So much money is being pumped into it, and barely anyone is covering it. The other part of this as well is that I mentioned Oxfam. I should talk a bit about how corporations have colonized civil society as well, particularly in aid. One example, which was pretty shocking for me at the time, I'm not shocked by this kind of stuff now, but we went to El Salvador in 2016, I think it was, and we did a story about this poor community that lived on top of an aquifer, and they couldn't afford the water that they were sitting on because the prices were too high. But yet down the road, there were all these multinationals bottling drinks like Coke and Fanta that we drink here. So we did this story for the Guardian. So I contacted Sab Miller, which is one of the companies that bottles Coke, and said, "Look, we've talked to all these poor people. They're really struggling, and you're bottling these drinks down the road." And they said they got really angry with me. One of the most aggressive PR teams I've ever dealt with. And then they said, "Look, read this report that we authored with Oxfam." So I sort of thought, okay. And then they sent me this report, which had the Sab Miller and Oxfam's logo on the same thing, which was basically exculpating them of any problems, any crimes in that area. So I kind of put up some resistance to it, but I think most journalists receiving that would see the sort of logo of Oxfam and think, okay, well, if Oxfam are saying they're all right, then they are all right. But that happens all the time.
So why is Oxfam saying that?
What Oxfam?
Because most people in Oxfam don't enter that game to provide a cloak fundamentally for multinationals destroying people's lives in the global south. So how has that happened?
Well, because of the budget problems, and also it's a function of the same dynamic that we've been talking about. Corporations have infested every part of our society. There's basically zero parts of our society that have escaped corporate power because they have all the money, and they've used these corporations to sort of a version of greenwashing. Obviously, it's not about the environment, although that also exists. But with aid organizations and humanitarian organizations, it gives them the perfect foil to do whatever they want. And in the case of Oxfam, it gets worse, this story, by the way. So we published the story eventually, and it's quite a hard-hitting story goes on for The Guardian. So obviously goes under the Gates Foundation logo. So then you see that happens. And the Gates Foundation is not a benign institution. It's part of this whole system. It's got a very particular way of looking at development, which is in line with corporate.
It's the godfather of this whole system. It's the Don Corleone of this whole system.
But and then 2 days after that, there's an article in The Guardian on the development site with the Bill Gates logo, which is a 900-word interview with the Latin America division head of Sab Miller.
Wow.
Basically talking about our article, not naming it, but defending Sab Miller's record in El Salvador. Saying that water stress is what these corporations always do. They say it's about corruption. You know, all these sort of words that they use to blame the victim rather than them. And then one more thing. And so then I start doing a bit of research and I see that Sab Miller funds part of The Guardian's website. So I don't know if Sab Miller called up and said, we fund part of your website, but so we want to write a reply. But
so that was my question. Do you think, because obviously there is a right, there's a right to editorial right to giving somebody the right to reply. You should do that if they've made your misgivings.
It wasn't presented like that.
But you don't think it was? Okay.
No, it was presented as just, they happened to publish this interview. It wasn't even, so it wasn't an advertorial. It wasn't a right of reply. It was just we'll interview this person about water stress in Latin America. It happened to be 2 days after we'd published this article. So they've infested the NGOs. They've infested the media, because obviously
the progressive press.
The progressive
this isn't
press.
The Times,
it's
or
often worse. In terms of, I don't know if you've seen recently. I saw some Novara journalists tweeting about the New Statesman and BAE Systems.
Yes,
there's a whole section, but in some ways, the Guardian and the New Statesman are worse than the right wing media in terms of doing the bidding of corporations. But so it's a panorama where they've just taken over. It's very, very few spaces now where you can have an independent give an opinion independent of media power, of corporate power, whether that be in the media, universities, whatever it is.
But hold on, it's not an opinion even. You were reporting facts.
Right, that's true.
You're reporting facts. And if you report facts, all of a sudden Sab Miller can place an interview within 48 hours. I mean, that's mad.
I know. And also, if you think about that, what that means in reality, that is The Guardian has given the last word to one of the richest corporations in the world who are doing awful things there over the voices of some of the poorest people in the world that we'd originally platformed. And that was how it ended. And this happens all the time. The point is, I wasn't working for The Guardian then. And also, I didn't really care about pissing them off by publicising it. So I did publicise it at the time. But I think most people just they wouldn't even...
of course.
They wouldn't even look at it, or they wouldn't even realise it had happened. They wouldn't do the research to see all these different pressure points which had been activated.
Or if you did bring it up, Matt, frankly, it's career suicide.
Exactly.
Let's be honest. Yeah. There's a reason why, might sound like it's cope from me, but there's a reason why people like you and me don't really appear on the BBC.
Definitely.
Or Sky, generally. Yeah. I mean, I only get a call from BBC or Sky so they can attack me for something.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Or I've got to just defend somebody. Yeah. But they don't say, what's your view on X, Y, Z? And there's a reason for that, because when you're honest about this stuff, it's not really good for, getting you up the greasy pole. You're saying about the media, do you think it's got worse with this stuff? Because I remember The Guardian, I don't want to stick on The Guardian too much, but it's really interesting because we don't have many progressive print publications in this country. It's one of them. And it feels to me like 15, 20 years ago, it was substantially better on this stuff. And now it's a lot worse. Do you think that's right?
I think it is across the board. It's not just corporations. It's also coverage of the security state, for example, which is what I cover day to day. That's just been completely jettisoned. Any kind of critical coverage of the military or intelligence agencies. It doubles up with the corporations. But I think that you've seen these interests really ramp up their attacks on independent spaces. So The Guardian, as you say, actually 20 years ago was actually not bad. Like, it wasn't perfect, far from it, but it had space for maverick reporters, people doing truthful, independent reporting regularly.
Yeah.
And that's been completely lost. And I think that part of it is that in terms of the corporations, for example, when they sign, I remember when it was sort of the advent of this corporate takeover of The Guardian would always say, when they started doing these sites in alliance with the corporations, well, we sign contracts where the corporations say they have no say over our editorial line. And I think that's probably true. But that's that's the direct relationship. But then 20 years later, when you've got like dozens of companies just all over, just with their logo all over your website, it has an effect on a sort of more general level. It's not conscious. It's not like they're saying, do this, do that. It's just because those logos are there. You work within a new framework. So that power is felt in a much more insidious way. And I think that's how it's worked. I think that's also how it worked with the security state as well, because I mean, actually, in the case of the security state with the Guardian, it's quite interesting. Like in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, we looked at the D-Notice Committee meetings, which for viewers, the D-Notice Committee is this media censorship organization run by the Ministry of Defense, and they meet every 6 months at the MOD with a small collection of journalists and basically discuss about what they can and can't publish. The Guardian,
which is very British because it's self-censorship, right? It's the media saying, "Yeah, we'll censor ourselves." Well, it's not like Stalin, where it's like you can't write
exactly.
this.
And America, I've talked to some American journalists about it. They just think, I mean, American journalism is far from perfect, but they literally can't understand how we put up with that. They say you meet with the state and in this formal way, like people do it, but behind closed doors. It's kind of embarrassing. But anyway, so those D-Notice Committee meetings showed that during the Snowden revelations, the intelligence apparatus and the MOD were freaking out big time because they were ignoring D-notices which were being sent out, the Guardian were. And then they, to cut a long story short, Russ Bridger, who was the editor at the time, agreed to add the deputy editor, Paul Johnson, to the D-Notice Committee, and he joined. So that was about bringing them in-house, about cultivating them. And then soon after that, the first ever interview of a sitting head of MI5 was granted to the Guardian. Soon after that, the first interview of the sitting head of MI6 was granted to the Guardian. So it was we did it in the first article we did for Declassified, myself and Mark Curtis. We kind of delineated how this had happened. And I think that it's the same with corporations. Independent spaces are a real threat, especially ones with resources, because the Guardian not only had the predilection to expose the security state and corporations, but it also had the resources. It's a big newspaper, global newspaper with a good reputation. When you got those two things combined, it's a threat to these power interests. So they had to take them down. And essentially, as a critical sort of independent media outlet, it doesn't exist anymore, in my opinion. They barely do stories that are of the caliber that they used to do at all. And it's kind of just become a bit of a tabloidy, uninteresting newspaper, in my opinion.
There's also a broader point here. Let's just stick with the media for a moment about how, for most of the last century, broadly anybody with capital, obviously it tended to be wealthier people, but it could be a trade union as well, right? Or the Scott Trust in the case of The Guardian. If you have lots of money, you can start a newspaper and it can wash its own face through selling copies of that newspaper if it can find a market. The market mechanism would pay for news. Clearly, in the last couple of decades, that's stopped because of the internet. Now, it still applies to some things, monthly publications or weekly papers or whatever. New York Times is doing great with its 10 million online subscribers. But generally speaking, they do have a daily newspaper with the market mechanism that's kind of disappeared. And what that means now is that news outlets are generally owned by the ultra-rich, whether that's Bezos with the Washington Post. Would they have done Watergate with Bezos in charge? Right? Or The Observer in the 1980s, showing that actually the BBC, going back for decades, had been vetting thousands of people to see their political connections fundamentally. If you were going to be anybody in the BBC, right the way from its beginning, right the way through to the late 1980s, probably still, but we don't know, you were basically vetted. And if you were, if you had strong left-wing connections, no, you wouldn't get senior jobs. That was exposed by The Observer. You have the story about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Okay, the paper was owned by Murdoch, but the point was that these papers were trying to sell news. They were trying to make money. And I think we're in a world now where I don't think legacy journalism does that anymore. I genuinely think we're now in a moment where legacy journalism does basically does PR.
I agree.
And we're in a really new world.
But don't you think it's very strange that dynamic has taken place at the same time as the media's opened up and democratized? You would have thought the opposite pressure would be. So the fact that Novara exists or Declassified, we couldn't have existed 20 years ago. So the media's been massively democratized by the internet, by social media. So you would have thought that the pressure that would put on the legacy media was that they had to open up because otherwise they're going to get outflanked. But actually, they've become more and more closed and more establishment friendly while alternative media, what's called alternative media, has blossomed. I can't get my head around why that is, but I totally agree with you. I think that the mainstream media is something very insidious and sinister has happened to it in the last 20 years. Because even if you remember during the war in Iraq, like what the media was like, the Mirror under Piers Morgan, who is a controversial figure, but it was incredible. I remember that I bought it every day during that build up to the war in Iraq, where the headlines were made out of oil companies' logos. There were pictures of George Bush and Tony Blair with blood all over their hands, stuff you would never, ever see now.
No.
I actually think that there was a concerted effort by the state to make sure that never happened again, because it was the media opposition and the mainstream media opposition to Iraq was a real problem for them executing that war. And probably stopped any movement onto Iran. Or
I was going to say the subsequent. And people say, "Oh well, the war happened anyway." Well, yeah, but we never went to Iran. In under Ed Miliband, Labour refused to bomb Syria, etc. Exactly. You can agree or disagree with those decisions, but the point is, they didn't happen. And I think the trajectory was diverted because of, like you say, media intervention. I think hostility from the public, which to an extent was reflected in the media, and now it isn't. And it is weird now. We're in the early 2020s. All the media talks about, and I know some of our viewers and our listeners care about this stuff, it talks about cake. It talks about speeding fines. And of course that stuff matters. Of course it matters. It doesn't matter half as much as the stories you're talking about. And they're not being relayed in legacy media for a reason. So let's put a pin in the media conversation, because we could talk about that all day. People who are listening, watching, probably remember about 20 minutes ago, I mentioned the fact that the British Overseas Development Aid budget was investing in gated communities, I believe in El Salvador. I mean, this really underscores an important point, doesn't it? That, we had NGOs, people like The Guardian, quote unquote progressive, saying we have to spend 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid, but it's about what you're spending, where, and who benefits rather than the amount of money. Like, I don't want to be giving money to gated communities in El Salvador. I would rather that number be lower. I would like it to be zero.
Yeah. I mean, I think if people understood where aid money was going, the whole budget would be stopped tomorrow. Because the interesting thing about aid is that the right is very critical of it. And if you read the Daily Mail, they've launched campaigns to get the aid budget down. But their perception of aid and their analysis of aid is extremely thin. And the major arguments that I've been making that should be made by the left are just non-existent. You can't hear them in the media at all. Partly because the place that you would normally hear them would be The Guardian, or you expect to hear them, but the whole of its development website is funded by the Gates Foundation. So to go back to the gated communities in El Salvador, one of the interesting facets of this whole thing is that the system that is being erected around the world and has been erected, which is corporate rule, has created an extremely divided society here, but also around the world. Everywhere you go, there's huge levels of inequality. So you now have a class of people in all these places that need to fence themselves off from the rest of society, to fence themselves off from the results of this system. So the El Salvador is an extremely poor country, and we went there in our reporting, but it's got little oases of huge wealth. And that's where the British money is going, because they think that there needs to be places for the rich to live, because that's part of their development model. For example, another example was Myanmar and the 5-star hotel which they were funding. We talked to the head of the IFC, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, when we were in Myanmar, and we said, can you at least justify why you're spending aid money on a 5-star hotel? And he said, well, look, they're opening up to the rest of the world. They need, when a businessman goes to Myanmar, he needs a place he's going to feel comfortable to stay, so he can go and negotiate with people to do business deals. And that's their argument. They don't and it makes sense, I guess, on some level. But when you look at a society like Myanmar, the problems it has, the scale of the problems, the last thing that you would locate as a thing that they needed was a 5-star hotel for rich people to go and invest. In fact, what they need is a development model that does not rely solely on the vagaries of foreign direct investment, which is what they're building. For me, the most shocking part of this book and the 2-year reporting project that went into it was the aid section, because everywhere I went, I saw that aid was not benefiting. Largely, there were small parts of it that were benefiting the poor, but largely was benefiting the richest people in the world, the corporations and the local elite. And secondly, the second part of that is that this is not a mistake. Originally, when I first started reporting, I was like, okay, well, they've obviously not thought this out. But when you start looking at the history of it and you look at how aid developed out of the fall of formal colonialism, you realize this has been designed from the start.
This is the plan.
This is the plan. The IFC, for example, the institution which I looked at most and which I've described, the arm of the World Bank, which was created in 1956. We went to the World Bank archives in Washington, D.C., and we looked at what the discussions were about why they were creating the IFC. And it was explicitly talked about as an arm of a tool in the Cold War. They wanted to expand capitalism in places which could fall to communism. So the best way to do that is to make the private sector as big as possible, right? So they'd say, we need this corporation to go in. But now the IFC is an investment bank. We talked to people on the inside who anonymously, and they said the IFC effectively functions as an investment bank, and it's a money earner for the World Bank group as well. So it's been completely perverted from any kind of development goal.
A few points. So I think most people that when they hear the words international development, they think kids getting books at school, like I said, clean drinking water, maybe an infrastructure project, right? A road. But they wouldn't hear in their mind, a 5-star hotel where businessmen can have a cup of coffee and make a business in it. It's fucking ridiculous, frankly. But like you say, it goes, I think, hand in hand with an idea that the more privatization, the more inequality, the better. And I think as an appendage to that, like the continuation with colonialism. With regards to, sorry, I'm coming back here. So I had a really interesting question for you. So we're going to talk about the diamond mine. That's it. And I suppose there's an outgrowth of that as well. I mean, you said that a lot of this is based upon anti-communism and opposition to communism during the Cold War at the end of the 1950s. So you've got Mossadegh, Arbenz in Guatemala, and Nasser in Egypt. And these guys weren't particularly left-wing, but I mean, actually, Arbenz was basically just a social democrat. But the point is, social democracy outside of the West wasn't allowed. But it wasn't just communism. I mean, there was very much a concern that global South countries would have nationalism, right? This force, which is apparently so normal in the West, you're allowed to be a nationalist in the UK or France, the US. But the minute you have a nationalism from a third world country, it was just, we cannot have that. So I think for an audience as well, because they might say, well, good anti-communism. Well, no, this is fundamentally about creating obstacles to nationalism and to the idea of, popular sovereignty. And again, it's something actually I think the left's been very weak on. The left says, all nationalism is bad. Well, actually, nationalism has created an incredible countervailing force against oppression, against imperialism for the majority of the world over the last 100 years. So maybe don't phrase things like that. You mentioned the World Bank. I mean, wow. Some of the stories about the World Bank were and this idea of it being an investment fund. Can you touch upon one project in particular in Tanzania? Yeah,
this was the other bizarre part of this whole system is you would expect a diamond mine to, if it was owned by a major company like De Beers, they would not need like non-commercial loans at favorable rates from a development institution to expand. You would have thought that they were integrated enough into the world of finance that they could get the loans that they wanted. But essentially, in this case, this diamond mine, which is now owned by Petra Diamonds, which is listed in London, said that they hadn't made a profit in like 10 or 15 years, which again, I was dubious of, because it's very nice to say that if you're in Tanzania, whose HMRC is probably like 5 or 6 guys in a room, and you've got like all these powerful accountants that can do interesting accounting to make sure you don't get a profit that you have to pay a tax on. I'm not saying that's what they did, but that is a massive power imbalance that you see around the world, where you have the corporate accountants and
it's not HMRC in this country, right? I mean, I don't think anybody would dispute that. Tanzania's ability to collect tax is probably quite limited.
Exactly. Yeah. But anyway, they said they hadn't, so they took money from the World Bank and the IFC to develop this diamond mine, and I went along there, and again, it's like so much of this new corporate geography around the world, where you go to a place like Tanzania, which is not one of the poorest African countries, but is pretty poor when you go there. And then you arrive at, so you're seeing all this sort of poverty around, and then you arrive at this. It's a campus. This diamond mine. It's not just a mine. It's got like a hospital and a school, and you go through the metal gates, and it's just like perfectly tarmac roads, a hospital that works, a school, people. Like looking happy, and that's what, and so you go there, then you get taken by a PR person around, and they're telling you all the wonderful things. But the funny thing is that when I interviewed the finance person at that mine, he said to me, "We didn't need the IFC's non-commercial loans. We could have easily done it without, but we liked having the imprimatur of the World Bank on our company. It was good for our respectability. It was good for our how we legitimacy, looked at legitimacy.
Right? How could we be exploiting people? The World Bank's helping us.
Exactly. And then so add that to the fact it's a diamond mine. So how does that benefit development? It's a private diamond mine that hasn't paid tax in over a decade. And the World Bank's argument is, well, it creates jobs and it develops the hamlets around the campus. So part of the whole propaganda tour I was taken to a local school which had been built by the company. It was like 50 kids packed into a little like brick school, tiny brick school. And then I interviewed some of the teachers, and they actually were quite outspoken to me. They said, well, They might have built us this, but they didn't. Like, where's the money for the central government? They were aware of what I'm talking about, which is that they avoid all this paying any tax to the central government, and then act like they're the saviors of the local community by building these pretty threadbare schools. And that is kind of what we saw all around the world. That the arguments are so thin for why they're investing in these high-end capitalist exploration endeavors, like a diamond mine or a 5-star hotel. It's all about creating jobs for the local community. Why can't you create a job for the local community by building something that's socially useful for poor people?
But also if it was publicly owned, or at least if the state, even if the state just has a 30% share, right? Exactly. Let's have a compromise here. Like, there's still the jobs.
Yeah, but this is a very important point that you bring up about the IFC, because the IFC doesn't just invest in private corporations to go into new markets. They have an advisory arm which is advising governments to privatize everything. Yeah. And there's a famous case where they got the main hospital in Lesotho to private. Oxfam did a whole report about this. The IFC helped Lesotho privatize their hospital, their main hospital, and then it started eating up like huge amounts of their health budget per year, extraordinary sums. And that is kind of replicated around the world. They're advising governments to privatize certain things and then investing in companies that might benefit from those privatizations. So there's a conflict of interest there.
Clearly, right? I mean, that's clear as day. As well with the World Bank, this was another one, Matt. It just, my jaw dropped, right? And I'm sure people who are familiar with Novara know I'm quite skeptical of many things. I'm a bit of a cynic even. But this idea that the World Bank invests to an extraordinary extent in companies registered in tax domains where they'll pay less tax. So for instance, companies which are operating in Africa, but they'll be domiciled in somewhere like the Mauritius because it's really it's a tax haven. Now, I'm not saying they're evading tax, but it's legal tax avoidance. And I find it incredible that the World Bank's development model would accept the possibility of we're helping a country develop by investing in a business which is in a tax haven. Can you explain that to me, please?
Well, we went to Mauritius actually because Mauritius is kind of an emblematic example of this whole system as well, because when it achieved independence, it was written off as kind of a basket case. It had no real resources or obvious way to develop out of the poverty that it was in, and then it was the World Bank promoted this whole idea of it becoming a tax haven. And now when you go there, there's like there's a huge financial district, insurance companies, all these international companies there. And we were looking at a company called Malawi Mangoes, which is registered in Mauritius. And we tried to get their accounts. You can't get their accounts in Mauritius because another part of this is that tax havens are secrecy jurisdictions. So we couldn't get any, even when we were in Mauritius, we went to their company's house and we couldn't get any details. But the IFC had invested in Malawi Mangoes.
Which is meant to be dealing with Malawi, which is a country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but they're registered in Mauritius. And yeah, I mean, the World Bank, I mean, to be honest with you, I think that the World Bank don't care because it's part of the whole model that they're promoting. Like they are promoting a corporate agenda, and their whole model rests on the fact that the only way the world can develop is by attracting foreign direct investment and attracting foreign corporations to go and invest there. Now, if you believe that's the whole of the riddle of development, then tax havens are a benefit because they help corporations, and anything that's good for corporations is good for development because there's no other way to develop. And I think that's what they think. I mean, they won't say that publicly. They would say, but they have no regulations in place to stop investments in companies that are registered in tax havens. For example, Malawi Wangos, and there's plenty of others. So, I mean,
But that's correct. I mean, that is really low-hanging fruit, Matt. Like, it's one thing having investments which don't find a big social return, but the idea that, we're going to help Malawi by helping a company registered in the Mauritius, which doesn't even pay tax to Malawi, it's mad. Like, the United States government is very good on businesses which make profit in its jurisdiction, which, are basically tax dodgers, much better than we are in this country, by the way. And yeah, or even US nationals who live abroad, they find them and they get them to pay the money. But then the whole model of development, which is really being pushed by the United States overseas, I mean, heaven forbid, the US is being hypocritical, of course, but this just strikes me as like utterly brazen. Like, how can you have a developmental model which doesn't even involve businesses which you want to grow? If you believe in the private sector, clearly those businesses should be paying tax to pay for state services. Clearly. But that doesn't even seem to be included there.
No. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, I agree with you. It's shocking. But then it's shocking that an aid organization whose stated goal is to alleviate global poverty is investing in a diamond mine in Tanzania. It makes no sense. Or a 5-star hotel, or a shopping center in El Salvador, or a gated community in El Salvador. There's every country in the world, there's these bizarre projects. And it goes to the fact that it's an extremist point of view, extreme economic ideology that has proven to be a disaster pretty much everywhere it's been practiced. Because you talk about nationalism, right? And I agree with you that it's often, especially in the developing world, those kind of economic nationalism is a good thing.
Yeah.
Resource nationalism. I used to
100%.
When I worked at the Financial Times, one of the funniest things about it was whenever any government talked about using the resources for themselves, nationalizing a mining company or taxing those corporations higher, it was called resource nationalism, and that was a pejorative. The idea it was seen as, oh no, that's a bad thing. You shouldn't be in control of your resources, and that's how it goes around the world. In Latin America, in the 50s and 60s, import substitution model was really successful. Massive keeping out products so you could develop your infant industries without flooding your own market with foreign goods. It's good. It's a good thing, and it helped develop domestic economies. That was completely destroyed in the 70s and 80s by these aid institutions, or the Bretton Woods institutions, which we're told are about development. And that's what I think that a realization people need to understand is that the word development is a very different thing if you work within these institutions. It's not helping the poor develop. It's greasing the entry of corporations into the developing world. That is the major role, because they believe that's the only way that the developing world can develop. And it's not a coincidence that they believe that. They believe that because essentially they're promoting an ideology which benefits the richest people in the world. That is, they were set up by the US and the UK, essentially.
I think most people say they're skeptics of sort of trade and aid. They're skeptics, but they'll say, look, it's a mixed bag. But from what you're describing, the existing trade and aid model, which we have with the World Bank, with the IMF, with aid agencies, with, various NGOs, it looks like, to me, a machine to generate inequality. It's like an algorithm to create as much inequality as possible. And you compare that to what's going on, for instance, in China, state-led, hundreds of millions of people brought out of poverty. Now, I'm not saying China's perfect, but you've got two quite different paradigms there, and it's quite obvious which one works.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, another example of this is I always think what must be amazing working in the World Bank and being an economist and trying to develop all these theories about how you get out of poverty, and then looking at Evo Morales' Bolivia. That started in 2000. Well, he was elected in 2005. Their model was to nationalize. They nationalized huge amounts of companies straight away within 100 days. They were were later praised by the World Bank and IMF for their economic success. Growth rates high, massive poverty reduction program. That was all done with policies which were the opposite of what the IMF and the World Bank tell you to do. And it's like you say, it's very, very bizarre that people don't look at that and think, well, maybe we're promoting the wrong policies. They do the opposite. They say, well, push it harder when countries come out of the cold. So, for example, in Myanmar, we went at an interesting time because it was at a time when they thought democracy was on a path towards democracy. And obviously, Myanmar's been out in the cold for decades. And we were talking to all these institutions about what policies they were instituting. And it was all the same ones I've been talking about. It was sign bilateral investment treaties enshrining ISDS, sign up for IFC loans to get foreign corporations to enter, open an SEZ, Special Economic Zone, which we went to. There was one called Tilawa, which was being set up actually by the Japanese aid agency. Because the other point is we should come on to Special Economic Zones, but they are often funded by aid organizations as well. Building a Special Economic Zone is our aid money is being used for. All these things, the menu of policies that the World Bank, IMF, regional development banks push on countries when they come in being reintegrated are all the ones that show, as you say, very, very little success in developing countries. And the reason, I mean, I don't think it's a conspiracy to say the reason that they hold to these quite extremist ideas that don't benefit the majority is because they're never more meant to. They're meant to benefit corporate power. They're meant to benefit the 1%. That was why they were set up in the first place. And I mean, sorry, I'll just finish with this. The person that talks about this quite eloquently is Joseph Stiglitz, who was a chief economist at the World Bank for a long time. And he wrote that famous book, Globalization and Its Discontents. Now, he's kind of still thinks that there was an idealistic thread and it went wrong. But if you read about the people that are in control now, he calls them extremists. They were people that during his time, he saw that they were taking over the levers of power within the World Bank particularly and pushing an extremist agenda, which is still in place and should be got rid of, because the other thing is development sounds boring when you say it to people, but what it describes is how the majority of humanity run their economies. It's extremely important what theories are being promoted because it has a massive impact on billions of people. So, but it's like you said before, the left, I don't think engage as much as they should on these issues because these were all issues that exercised the left in the 90s, right, at the end of the Cold War. And particularly you had like Seattle, every WTO meeting was there were huge protests. And then that all stopped with September 11th and the drive to war in Iraq. The left's attention moved away from what was called the anti-globalization movement, which was a misnomer, but it was a big movement globally towards the anti-war movement and the war on terror. And I think that maybe that's dissipating a bit, but I think that the left needs to re-engage with these issues because for me, having written this book and having looked into this stuff, I think that there's no way you can understand politics today here globally without seeing it through the lens of corporate power and how they've taken over and cannibalized the state that created them.
Let's talk about Europe quickly, because there's a bank that's equivalent to the World Bank. It's called the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, and it's funded by European Union member states, i.e. their taxpayers. So explain to me how Europe's taxpayers, including British taxpayers, helped fund the expansion of Lidl.
Yeah, well, so the EBRD is another interesting institution, which was set up at an interesting time. It was set up in April 1991 at the end of the Cold War. And what it was about was essentially the same as the World Bank. It was about integrate the World Bank after the Second World War. It was about integrating Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, into the capitalist system. And it was on the principle of the same as the IFC. We will invest in the private sector, which might otherwise not want to go to these new markets. Now, like with the IFC, it's just become a complete racket and joke. Like they've spent $1 billion giving Lidl money to expand into Eastern Europe. And this is a huge, massively rich corporation. It does not need non-commercial loans to expand into different places anywhere.
We say we, but again, just to be clear, this is taxpayer money coming from the UK or France or Italy, and it's been giving to Lidl, this huge multinational, to expand and to make more money.
Yeah. I mean, and Lidl has huge. The other part of this is that a lot of the companies that have invested in have huge controversies about how they treat workers. Lidl, particularly in Eastern Europe, we went to Poland and a couple of other places and talked to workers who work for Lidl, and they said that their conditions were bad and that the company was actually uniquely bad in comparison to other ones. So it's not just, it's aid money that they don't need, taxpayer money to expand that they don't need, and the company itself is not is particularly and uniquely bad treatment of its workers. So it makes no sense. But as I said, sorry to go back to the same point, but it doesn't make sense if your understanding of aid and development is the one that comes straight from the World Bank. Well, if you believe that they're telling the truth and that their aim is to alleviate global poverty, it doesn't make sense. If you start looking into it and understanding that that's a lie, and it's about greasing the entry of corporations into new markets, and it's also about enshrining capitalism as a system in all over the world, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, then it makes sense.
But not even capitalism, right? Because as you talk about in the book, Lidl's growth meant that smaller retailers, grocers, etc., closed down outdoor food markets, which, by the way, were selling produce at a cheaper rate. So it's not like they were breaking up food cooperatives or something. Like there was a very different kind. There was a particular kind of capitalism, I should say, which was being imposed on Central and Eastern Europe. And it seems to me like basically the EBRD and the European Union, the bigwigs in Brussels and Strasbourg, and yes, I sound like Farage, sorry. Sometimes people disagree with the right about something. They basically wanted a European Walmart. So it was like a status symbol. We have a single market, so we have to have like across the whole continent, because we believe in this federal project of like a European Walmart. Who's going to pay for it? European taxpayer. Meanwhile, you've got, little execs making big bucks. And it's insane, Matt, the idea that expansion is being funded by the taxpayer. Final question, because you spoke about it earlier, and obviously you're very passionate about it. Special economic zones. Where do these fit? We associate them with China, but clearly they're quite integrated with trade and aid.
Yeah, I mean, it's all part of the same menu of policy prescriptions, which is offered by the World Bank. This was the most interesting part of the book for me personally to report, because I just think it's kind of a parable for the whole story. Because I'll just explain what a special economic zone is. A special economic zone is a territory which is chiseled off from the national territory in terms of tax regime, import, export tariffs, customs, all that, all the stuff that a national government imposes on corporations when they work in a country is off. Those laws don't apply. So we call them in the book corporate utopias, and that's essentially what they are. They were created, actually, funnily enough, and this was a really interesting part of the story, which was that the first special economic zone ever, or what so called, was in Shannon in Ireland, in West Ireland, and we went to Shannon to report it. And this was a sort of really mercurial entrepreneur called Brendan O'Regan. He's quite famous in Western Ireland. He had this idea that Shannon needed to have a new development model after, because it's a famous airport, and it was an airport that refueled airplanes that were transatlantic flights. And when technology developed enough that an airplane could go further, they were basically going to be out of any kind of work. So he said, well, what we should do is we should create this little zone where corporations could do what they want. They don't have to pay the tax to the government. They don't have to do all the import, export duties and customs. And they did it. And that was in 1956. And it has absolutely exploded. As you mentioned, China, it's basically the model which has propelled China to economic superpower status. And they're quite aware of that. The funny thing was, when we were in Shannon, the head of the Shannon Chamber of Commerce said that Chinese dignitaries often come. And Xi Jinping was there not that long ago. Yeah. And they said, I think it was Xi, they said that it was either him or a previous leader made a request when they came that they wanted to stop in the taxi to the hotel when he came to Shannon on Tully Glass Hill, which is this hill overlooking this. I've been there. It's just a nondescript hill overlooking a grey industrial estate in Western Ireland. And the second most powerful man in the world requested that the taxi could stop on the way to the hotel so he could have a moment of pause for reflection to look at the Shannon economic zone, special economic zone, because the Chinese are like, this is where it all began. But it's become as I said, it's gone all over the world, and it's come to Britain. 2 years ago, Rishi Sunak, it wasn't Rishi Sunak then, but the UK government announced that we're going to have 13 free ports here, whereby, and it's the same special economic zone idea, corporations won't have to abide by national laws. And I think that what you've seen with the development of the special economic zone is more and more pressure to create a global economy and national laws in corporate interest, because often policies which are trialed in special economic zones are then become national policies. And in fact, we use the term in the book, special economic world. We're living in a special economic world now. The race to the bottom means that the most successful countries for attracting foreign direct investments are the ones that have bad labor laws, bad environmental law, regulations, all the stuff that we think of as the basis of a civilized society. That's what you can't have if you want to attract foreign direct investment. And as I've said, the World Bank, the IMF, that's the only way you can develop, is to attract foreign direct investment. So special economic zones are kind of, for me, the emblematic case. And I'll just finish with this, that I went to Cambodia. I think this was probably the most profound reporting trip that I made during the book. I went to Cambodia to report from 2 special economic zones in one in Phnom Penh and one in a place called Ba Viet, which is on the border with Vietnam. And actually, they're often built on the borders because of trade. And Ba Viet, actually, just because everyone's talking about Henry Kissinger at the moment, Ba Viet was one of the places that he destroyed in Operation Menu during the Vietnam War. But I actually, they wouldn't let me in. And then I snuck it, the one in Ba Viet, they wouldn't let me in. And then I snuck in and started interviewing workers within the special economic zone. And it was an incredible experience, because they basically said, like, we can't organize here. So part of the special economic zone is about warehousing workers. And they said, if we try and organize, they will sack us, or even we might be the victims of physical violence. And what I was told was that often in places, in special economic zones in Cambodia, but it happens around the world, is that workers will just erupt in violent outbreaks because they're not allowed to organize in a legitimate way. There's just constant violence. They'll start smashing up the machines. They'll beat up their manager, whatever it is. And that happened all over Cambodia and the world. And it really did show me the power of unions and how important they are to a civilized society, because most of the unions in Cambodia, even the ones that did operate, were called yellow unions. They were co-opted by the corporations or the state. And I did interview some independent unions, and they were just working within extremely difficult conditions in terms of repression from the state, repression from the corporations. But they were winning. Like the minimum wage when I was there was being raised, and it was a kind of an amazing experience in the context of all this corporate power, in the context of working within special economic zones. They were winning, so that was quite a hopeful way to end it. And I think that we haven't touched on this, but I want to just say it before we end, that a major part of this is not just corporations exerting their power. A major part of this is states exerting power on behalf of corporations. Because everywhere I went in the world, whether it be peasants in Tanzania, poor people in Colombia being victimized by paramilitaries, wherever it was, I'd say, okay, well, look, you're being oppressed by this corporation because you're standing up for your rights. What's your government doing for you? And they will say, oh, don't be silly. The government works for the corporation. Every single one. That's how it works. The government is not working for the people. The government is working to help the corporation enforce their rule in that person's country. And that's a very important conceptual understanding to come to, because it's the opposite of what we're told, which is that the state and the corporation are two adversarial power centers, and they duke it out. But they don't. The corporation has a supranational system, which we talked about, which operates above national governments. But even the national governments themselves have become completely infested with corporate power. And in some ways, it's very explicit. For example, in the UK, the Department of Trade and Industry as a whole taxpayer-funded body called the Defence and Security Organisation, which its role is to promote arms companies around the world, private arms companies. We pay for that, mainly BAE Systems. But that's a very explicit bit. It operates on a much more implicit level across the board as well. So I think that the left going forwards needs to understand that if we don't see the level of power that corporations have accrued and understand how they're exerting it, then we're going to be fighting the wrong battles, because the corporations want us to be want a certain discourse on the left. I think the discourse we have now, the culture war, is a function of the corporate takeover of our whole discourse, in that it's really conducive to corporations just working in the background and no one really talking about them and no one really operating any kind of pressures on them to stop the cannibalization of all our resources. Corporate-friendly identity politics has taken off, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's very conducive to certain interests that we constantly talk about culture war issues, and that's the left and the right, and we ignore bigger structural economic issues at our peril.
Matt Kennard, that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.